Hello, and welcome to Lion and Mouse Commentary. I'm Holland, and this is my best friend Tori.
Hello!
If you're new to our show, we rank various forms of entertainment by different categories out of a total score of 10, with only 2 points allowed for our personal taste. Don't worry, we break everything down as we go. Feel free to agree, disagree, or just find something new to enjoy. Just be sure to tread lightly, there will be hot takes and spoilers. Cut to the intro. Alright, today I chose The Pacific, which is the HBO TV miniseries, for us to review. This is actually familiar to me. I've seen it all the way through once. It's been a while since I've watched it. But this is blind to Tori. So if this is new to you, I've got some background information, and then you can click off and go watch it for yourself if you don't want any spoilers.
And we only covered the first episode in this podcast.
Correct.
Yeah.
So here's the synopsis from HBO. It says, from Tom Hanks, Steven Spielberg, and Gary Goetzman. I don't know if that's how you say his name, so I apologize if you're listening. The producers of the Emmy and Golden Globe winning 2001 HBO miniseries Band of Brothers, comes this epic 10-part miniseries that tells the true stories of three Marines fighting in the brutal Pacific Theater during World War II. So the three Marines that this story follows are Robert Leckie, Eugene Sledge, and John Basilone. The Pacific is a 2010 American war drama miniseries produced by HBO, Playtone, and DreamWorks that premiered in the US on March 14th, 2010. It's a companion piece to the 2001 miniseries Band of Brothers and focuses on the United States Marine Corps' actions in the Pacific Theater of World War II. It centers on the different experiences of these three Marines that I just mentioned, who were in different regiments of the 1st Marine Division. It features battles including Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, and Okinawa. Just some information about the series. It was produced by Steven Spielberg, Tom Hanks, and Gary Goetzman in association with HBO miniseries Playtone, DreamWorks, 7 Network, and Sky Movies, and ended up costing over $200 million to produce.
Wow.
It won an Emmy for Outstanding Miniseries, and it won various Creative Arts Emmy Awards, including Art Direction, Casting, Makeup, both prosthetic and non-prosthetic categories, Sound Editing, Sound Mixing, and won Outstanding Special Visual Effects. It was inducted into the 2019 Online Film and Television Association Awards Hall of Fame for television programs. And then it stars James Bridge Dale, Joseph Mazzello, John Seda, Ashton Holmes, Josh Hellman, and Rami Malek, who is not in episode 1, but the rest of the cast.
I didn't see him.
Yep, the rest of the cast are in this first episode. Episode 1, which is the one that we will be reviewing, was directed by Timothy Van Patten. The writing credits include Bruce McKenna, and then the writing credits also include Robert Leckie and Eugene Sledge. Their writings were used in the development of this film, and it features the Battle of the Tenaru and the Battle of Savo Island in this first episode. Here's a brief episode synopsis, just to kind of give you an overview. If you really don't want to hear it, go ahead and click off now, but this is just kind of a general synopsis of the plot. In December 1941, in the aftermath of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Robert Leckie tells his neighbor Vera that he's enlisted in the Marines and impulsively suggests that he might write to her while he's overseas. Sergeant John Basilone and his Marine brothers-in-arms, J.P. Morgan and Manny Rodriguez, listen as their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller, explains that they will be sent to the Pacific Theater of Operations, where they will be fighting for, quote, tiny specks of turf that we have never heard of. Meanwhile, Alabama teenager Eugene Sledge is devastated when his physician father, Dr. Sledge, confirms that he still has a heart murmur and it will prevent him from enlisting in the Marines like his best friend, Sid Phillips. So that synopsis is also from HBO. It's listed on their website under the title of this first episode. So we're just reviewing episode 1, and we will maybe, if you guys want us to, continue to review the series. But Tori's going to go ahead and kick us off with the first category.
Okay, so the first category for shows is plot, story, and cohesion. Out of 2 possible points, I gave this 1.5 points. I am the kind of person that has a very strong belief that you do not need dialogue to give good storytelling. And But those moments are still written moments. They're just not written as dialogue. And I think there are a lot of really, really beautiful moments in this first episode that don't need dialogue at all. It sort of sets up by giving us a small insight into the lives of each of the three protagonists that this series follows. One of those being the sort of family dinner of, I think it's John Basiloni's family dinner, and he brings a couple of his Marine friends with him to that dinner. And there's a moment where he is sitting at the end of the table with who I assume is his father or maybe grandfather, and he literally just has his hand resting on that man's hand. And there's no dialogue between them at all. But there is such a beautiful understanding that's portrayed of the fact that this is the last like real moment that they'll have together before he's sent off to war. And then it switches to Bob Leckie leaving for his duty. And the whole time his father is just complaining about different things wrong with his car. And while I was watching it, I could not ignore that juxtaposition between those scenes. And in one scene, there's a lot more dialogue, and it's, Leckie's father just complaining and complaining, and does not even pay attention to the fact that his son is literally leaving for war right now. And this is the last moments that they're going to have together before he goes and potentially never comes home. And you can just see Leckie standing there. He doesn't say much. He just stands there and watches his father. And like you can almost like see on his face like the heartbreak where he's like, my dad literally doesn't care. My dad literally does not care that I'm about to leave for war. And he says, well, this is it, Dad, I'm going. And what does his dad do? His dad extends a hand to shake his hand. And when you compare the two scenes, you get this idea of like all of these men had real home lives, because this is based on real men and real stories. These men had real home lives, and they have to leave all of that behind and go fight together in this war. And these moments, while they seemed really small in comparison to the rest of the focus of the episode, which is the realities of war and these battles that are portrayed in this episode, it seems like such a small moment, but I really didn't want to gloss over it because I think those storytelling moments are so important, because if you don't have storytelling moments like that in the beginning to establish your characters, you do not have the same attachment or care for them through the rest of the series. So I think that setup was just so perfect, and the pacing in those moments was just so perfect, because these are real men with real stakes. And I think that when you take real stories, those real stories make the most compelling, cohesive like moments that you can deliver. I don't want to say that like movies or TV shows that are written as movies and TV are in any way bad, because we get obviously all sorts of creative, wonderful stories. But when you're dealing with something like the subject of World War II, I feel like when you use real events and real men and real letters and documents from these men that are portrayed, this is the sort of adaptation that feels the most honorable. And I love that they did that. This is a fairly simple plot, but the depth of this plot comes from the reality of what was going on and the depth of the characters, and because they're not just characters, that these were real men. So when you have that sort of context, I think everything else about the plot, it doesn't matter if it's very straightforward, because you don't really need fluff in a story like this. You get all of the like distinct beats and moments from the characters, and I'll talk about that when we get to that. I do think that, would I say that this episode was cliffhangery at the end? No, I don't think it was cliffhangery, but I do think, and this is why I didn't give it full points, it felt like a really unsatisfying place to end it. I don't know why they ended the episode with sort of acknowledging the birthday of somebody in the battalion. I don't know if they were just trying to like bring a level of humanity back to the fact that they had just been through, you know, what feels very inhuman. War feels inhuman, I think, and you have to detach yourself, I think, from humanity in order to get through things like war. And you see moments of that, which I'll talk about again later in characters. But I don't know. It felt weird, the way that they ended it, and I felt a little unsatisfied at the end. And that's really the only reason, and I'm just being kind of nitpicky, that I didn't give it full points.
I think that's valid, but I also think it's tough, and this is the first time that we're reviewing a mini series, so it's tough because I also kind of echo that note. This episode, I think plot-wise feels like it's half an episode, like you don't have a full resolution of a storyline, but it's a 10-part miniseries, so it's kind of a difficult way to judge it. But I do think it has a very poignant ending, because I think you realize for the first time that this member, Sid Phillips, they sing happy birthday to, they hand him a grenade and sing him happy birthday because this boy just turned 18. Like, this is a child. He was a child when he joined a war this graphic and brutal. And you have somebody like Lecky, who is a grown man. And he looks like a grown man, which I have no, personally, this is just full disclosure, I have no idea how old the real Robert Lecky was when he was in the Pacific Theater, but he looks older than 18. And so I think it was kind of a poignant moment where these men who just went through a battle have now kind of pulled back into themselves and experienced this humanity of, oh, you just turned 18 a few weeks ago. Happy birthday. Here's your birthday present. The only thing I can give you is a grenade because we're still at war, and we're going to sing you happy birthday while we continue to march into the jungle because there are still people out there trying to kill us.
Right.
And I think that's a very poignant ending, but not to say that you shouldn't give the score you gave, but I think that it's not satisfying because it feels very harrowing, and I think that's the point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't disagree, but I think since this is blind for me and all I have is this first episode, I wasn't super satisfied with the ending. So that's the only reason that I gave it 1.5 points out of 2.
Okay. I also gave it 1.5 points out of 2. I wanted to echo a lot of what you said. I agree with. I think that overall, some notes I have that are a little distinct from yours. Overall, I think it sets up the plot really well. The plot is given with Chesty giving this briefing to the Marines of like, hey, we're going to the Pacific. They're worrying about Germany over there, which I think arguably for most Americans and, maybe Europeans too, probably, every time you think of World War II, you think of Nazi Germany, and nobody thinks about the Pacific theater and the fight against the Japanese army. And so I think that that's a forgotten war, or a forgotten part of the war. And so I think that Chesty's kind of brief to the men about, we're going over to these little spots of land nobody's even heard of, and places like, and he mentions Guam like it's some unheard of place, which is now a U.S. territory. Mm-hmm. But he mentions these places, and so it kind of sets up like, hey, we're going to learn about, you're going to follow these men through this sort of forgotten battle, series of battles as a part of a war that a lot of people forget about. And I think it was a really good setup of, okay, that's why this is called the Pacific. Like, here are the people you're going to follow. They introduce those characters very well. And so you get this overview of, the Marines standing looking at a map. And then you kind of narrow into these different family dynamics. And so you're shown the backstory of these three men. So you're shown Barcelona's family dinner, like you mentioned. You showed Lecky and his father, like you mentioned. You see Lecky talking to this girl Vera that he's going to write letters to. So you establish his kind of family dynamic and Barcelona's family dynamic with the men that he's with. And then you establish Eugene Sledge's family dynamic and Sid's family dynamic through Eugene Sledge's kind of lens. So I think it does a really good job of setting up what this big conflict is, what the war is all about, and now you've focused in on these men, and it's really about these men. So, and how the war impacted them and how they impacted the war. And I think that's was just beautifully told, and it could have been very convoluted. It could have been very melodramatic, over dramatic. It could have brushed over stuff too quickly. Things could have felt like, cookie cutter or very trite. And I think they just told it very tastefully. The pacing of that was all done really well. I love that it kind of shows these men and their families, and then you see Lecky and these men in the dining hall, this kind of chaos of the Marines in the dining hall before they're about to, put their boots on the ground on this, island, who knows where, that they can't even pronounce. That kind of very chaotic environment where you have this very realistic depiction of this kind of bravado. These Marines are like, I'm going to mow them all down like turkeys. It's going to be like a turkey shoot. Just this very common... It's almost like an ignorance is bliss. Like they don't even know what they're in for yet. And they think this is going to be, they're excited and just ready to go. It's this very big contrast when that's kind of setting up, not just who Lecky is. We saw him on, the civilian side. Now we see him in this dynamic of the men he's with. And it kind of sets up this broader cast of characters in that as well. And I think that just, it could have been very chaotic, very convoluted, and they did a really good job of kind of filling you in and building this world for you as you go. Overall, the plot could have been extremely heavy-handed in the gore and the violence, and although they don't downplay the brutality of the war on these battles, the way that they tell the story overall is really just, these are the facts. This is what happened. They're not over glorifying war. They're not making it this like over romanticized, battle. They're not overdoing it on the gore. It's almost like you're watching it and the story's being told to you as, this is what happened. This is how violent it was. This is how gory it was. This is how miserable it was. It's not overly dramatic, which I really appreciate. I think it's just done very respectfully and very tastefully while not downplaying anything and also not elevating war to this, pie in the sky, admirable, beautiful thing, which could be very easy to do because World War II, American World War II veterans are incredible people, and it's easy to view their experience through these rose-colored lenses, and that's not done in this episode. One reason I didn't give this full points is they don't spoon-feed you anything. There's almost no expositional dialogue.
Right.
It's like you're a fly on the wall watching this happen. People aren't explaining things to the main character so that you can now explain it to the audience. People aren't overusing someone's name so you can keep up with what that guy's name is. Nothing is spoon-fed to you. And I appreciate that and I like that, but also it makes things kind of difficult to follow.
Yes.
You're watching these ships getting fired upon in the ocean. I don't know whose boats those are. Is that the Navy? Is that the Marines? Is that the America? Is that the Japanese? I don't know. There's just explosions happening. I'm watching these men comment on it, but I'm not told anything about what that is. And so if you're not willing to just sit and go along for the ride and just take it in and pick up what you pick up, and if you don't know what's going on, just kind of follow the ride anyways, it can be very confusing. If you're not an expert on war terminology, things that people say is going to be really confusing. You don't know who's, they're talking about this guy who's not here and this guy went home and these people are supposed to be picked up and those people took our supplies. None of that is explained. It's just you're given the information as if you're a fly on the wall watching it all happen. And I think that's the creative direction of the plot, but I think it also makes for a very confusing plot, and even to the point where you're not really sure if this character is somebody you've met before or not, because they've gone through war and now they're all dirty looking and nobody's overusing their name to remind you, oh, remember this guy? Mm-hmm. So that's why I took off half a point, only because for an introductory episode, it can be kind of confusing to follow. But otherwise, 1.5 points out of 2.
Okay. Okay, so our next category is characters. Out of a possible 3 points, I gave this a full 3 points. Just this first hour, I think really blew me away with not just the characters who are portrayals of real life people, but the acting was just absolutely phenomenal. And I don't know what the real men who are being portrayed looked like or anything like that. So I have nothing to say in regards to like if they casted men that look like them or whatever. I have no insight into that. However, I can say that I have been blown away by the acting in just an hour of this first episode. I think the insight to each home life gives us a really good idea of the personalities and sort of temperaments of our 3 protagonists, Bob, John, and Eugene. I think every single one of their little home looks, the looks into their home, really made me emotional. And this was me meeting these guys. And I still got so emotional just with the acting, and the relationships feel so real and established. I didn't have to sit around like trying to guess, the attachments between characters. It's just very, very evident between like friends and family and all of that good stuff. It all just felt really genuine and really authentic. And the secondary characters are bringing a lot of depth and varied life to these characters. So you have, the other members of the regiment, the other members of the families, those sorts of things. Even if they only have a couple lines or no lines at all, there's a lot of really good moments. Like with Eugene's mom, Eugene's dad comes in and says, the murmur's still there. He's really disappointed. And she said a line, "I'm his mother." And it's like, it's a vague-ish line, but it's loaded with like tons of emotion. And I just thought, oh my gosh, that was such a good moment. It gave me chills. This episode does focus mostly on Bob Lesky, which is fine. Leckie. Sorry, I keep saying Lesky. But Bob Leckie. It does focus the most on him in this episode, and I think that's fine. And I think because of that, we get to really see some of the nuances of Bob as a man and as a Marine. And there's a lot of moments, I wouldn't say a lot, there are a few really good, poignant moments where you can see in his face and in his eyes the struggle that he has in what he sees and what he experiences. You can see that he values life, so taking life is a struggle for him to do. And you can also see that he has a big sense of duty to his country and to the greater good. So I think those two parts of him, you can kind of see warring in him a lot of this episode. And it really makes him feel so real because, you think about things like war and you do kind of have to detach yourself from the reality, but you still see sort of like through the chinks of his armor, if you will, that even though he understands that like this has to be done in order for the war to be won and for justice to prevail, there's still that level of this is another human that I have to, choose to kill for sake of protection and duty and, just the overall good. So seeing those moments, I think, is really emotionally fueled as a viewer because you can understand it. It's very instinctual human emotion, and he doesn't have to say anything, and you understand exactly what's going through his head. That sort of acting, I think, is very rarely found. Do I think there's great actors today? Absolutely. I'm not saying that. But I'm just saying I find it rare that you can watch a character on a screen and it's almost like you can hear them saying dialogue without them actually saying anything. And you get that a lot in Bob's character in this episode. There are some stereotypical like Marine moments and jokes, but I think that they give moments of levity to the overall heavy subject of war. So, is there some language? Yes. But it's believable because, these are Marines in the war, and that sort of thing is to be expected. And, they make silly jokes about, somebody's girlfriend in Samoa or whatever. And, there are some like stereotypical kind of things, but I think they all feel pretty genuine to the context of the situation. And I think they're needed. And you want to see your characters that you're rooting for, even in the midst of something hard and heavy. You do root for moments, like even just small moments of joy for them. So to see the regiment laugh together, even just briefly, I think just sort of helps solidify your connection as a viewer to the men that you're seeing on screen. The believability, though, if anything, if I had to like give one keyword to the characters and acting section of this review, it would be believability. The believability is just so high. And have these actors been through war? No. But they have taken the material and they've taken the real letters and documents left behind from the men that they're portraying, and they have truly absorbed them in such a way that they understand the goal of their portrayal and how to do that in such a way that makes it feel like it's happening now, or that it's just as relatable now as it was then. And so that believability, I think, is just really, really to be commended. Everybody feels so fleshed out, even just from the beginning of episode 1 to end of episode 1. You see growth in these characters. You see these men who go in as, jovial, joking Marines, and then they get through a battle, and you can see, even in the characters that take it harder than others, in all of characters across the board, you can see there's a little bit of a difference. Once they experience the stakes, that now kind of hovers over them, and you can just see that weight a little bit. So that sort of growth and change in characters is what I like to see, whether for the good or bad. But it's believable because when situations like that happen to people, they do end up changed. So if you're acting the exact same as you did in the flashback scenes, or not flashback scenes, but scenes where I saw you leaving for war, if you're acting the same after your first war battle, then it disrupts the believability, and there's none of that. Everything is just so consistently believable the whole way through. I do agree with what you said in plot about how it's kind of hard to follow sometimes, and there are a lot of secondary characters, so it's kind of hard to remember who is who. But I think generally all of these men are fairly likable, which I think helps. However, they're not likable in ways that feel fake or like caricatures of men. They do feel like real men who go through varied emotions. And I think you root for them more because of that. They're not portrayed as, these perfectly capable, skilled, suave Marines. They are portrayed as real men who have a sense of duty and know what needs to be done. And in that way, I think it makes them more likable. That's really all I have on characters. I have literally no critiques or complaints. So 3 out of 3 for characters.
Alrighty. I agree with a lot of the sentiments you just said. Out of 3 points, I gave it 2.5 points out of 3. My big takeaway note is all of these characters immediately feel like real people. And a lot of this that you kind of touched on in the plot and the story delivery, I attribute to the characters. So much of the acting. The acting's phenomenal in this first episode, but so much of the acting is subtle and it's all visual. There's very little dialogue, especially once we get onto the island with Lecky and they're, trekking through the jungle. Most of the acting is just nonverbal. There's a part that's particularly poignant when the soldiers are navigating through the jungle and they come across these dead soldiers, these bodies, and the camera pans onto their faces, and you're just watching every one of them as they walk by, and their faces as they're seeing really kind of, it's for them, this is their first glimpse at the brutality of war. And not even your main cast, but these minor characters that are unnamed, that acting is just done so well. It's just very poignant. It's very respectful. It's very powerful storytelling, and no dialogue was needed. So that just kind of overall makes all of these characters, even the ones that are unnamed minor characters, just all feel like real people. For the main cast especially, the backstories that they all have at the beginning of the plot, you see the world where they come from, it gives them these really interesting backstories and these immersive environments. So not only are they real people, but their families are real people, and the way that they interact with their families are real relationships. And so, like you said, it just contributes to that believability that these are real men who happen to be soldiers. These aren't superheroes that are wearing World War II uniforms. So it's just very good storytelling, and it makes for really powerful characters. Lecky is I would say the main character of this episode. And again, kind of going back to what I said in the last category, they don't spoon feed you anything in this episode. And so, he mentions to his dad that he thought about packing his typewriter. He's sitting in the mess hall, and the other soldiers are calling him Professor Lecky. So you get these subtle clues, which, I guess you could argue if it's subtle or not so subtle. But you get these cues in learning about him that he is a very intellectual person. That he's intellectual. He's a thinker. He, quotes, I don't know what poem he quotes when they ask him, why are we even going here? He quotes literature, a work of literature. And so then also you get to hear him narrate, which normally I don't like narration in movies, but in the context of him writing a letter, he narrates his perspective of his experience. And then just very subtle ways of just opening him up as a character, just the way that he, the actor does great portrayal of when they're shooting at this Japanese soldier and, really toying with him, and he's suffering unduly in that moment. And Lecky's reaction to that, and then he ends up killing this Japanese soldier. And then his portrayal of that, you're watching him struggle, like you mentioned. And then you watch him go through a Japanese soldier's belongings, and he finds a photograph, of his family. And it pulls you into this, not just as the plot, but it pulls you into Lecky as a character, caring about the humanity of this man, mm-hmm. and the humanity of these people, that they are not just losing on their side of the battle, but that they're fighting against as well. And so it's just very deep character moments with very little dialogue. There's no exposition that breaks all of that down for you. It's just portrayed for you on film. You kind of touched on some of these points in our last category, the scenes where John Basilone is in his house, and when he and his dad puts his hand on him, and the look that they give each other, just it's completely visual, and it's just great character development, storytelling, character acting. The dialogue between Eugene Sledge and Sid Phillips before they leave, it's just a normal conversation. He's handing his friend a book. Here, this is for you for when you leave. You might want something to read on the train, or, you might be bored. And yet it dives into these characters, into who they are as people, while still having an organic, genuine conversation between two young friends. And one of them's about to go to war, and one wishes he could go to war and can't. So it's very, very complex character arcs and character development. And then you do, like you mentioned, they do grow at the end of that episode. You're hearing Sid Phillips, you see him saying goodbye to his friend, and now you're seeing him read a letter from his friend at the end of the episode. And so just his perspective has changed, and his, here Eugene Sledge is writing him, telling him, you're lucky you got to go to war. And now you're hearing him read that letter aloud from a man who has experienced the brutality of war. It's great character development. It's so good. I can't, say too much about it. It's just done very, very well. I also agreed with what you said about the humor, these moments where it brings some levity to what could be an overly heavy, very depressing, sad story. That just could be very hard to digest. And yet they have these moments where these Marines are heckling each other, and the new regiment or, battalion comes in and they're, heckling each other on that. And yet they're acknowledging, man, do you see those guys? They've gone through hell and back is basically what they're saying.
Yeah.
And yet they're still giving each other a hard time because that's what Marines do, so it brings some levity, but then you get these moments where you see how they understand the reality of war. They're not joking to make light of a situation. They're joking with each other to kind of cope, because it's the only way you can really cope in those moments. I did take off half a point because this was something that I remembered from watching this episode for the first time blind, is that, again, because they don't spoon feed you, it can be very easy to not understand who you're watching on the screen. So, for example, you meet Sid Phillips at the beginning of the episode with Eugene Sledge, and they have a conversation. You don't hear his name again until the end of the episode. So this whole episode, you were watching Sid Phillips, but if you didn't recognize him immediately, you're never told, hey, remember this guy? You met him earlier. And again, I don't think that's necessarily a disservice to the plot. It's just the way the story was told. But it does make it difficult to follow the characters because you're not being reminded of who they are. And once they've gone through war, they look different, So that's why I took off half a point, because as a viewer, you're still trying to digest the story. The first time I watched this episode, I never connected the dots that John Basilone, who you met at the beginning, was one of the members at the regiment that came, or excuse me, I believe it's a battalion. I'm sorry for all the Marines that are listening. I'm not in the Marines, but I had no idea that was John Basilone that came in as reinforcements to Lecky's battalion. So those kind of dots that are very important to connect, and it's impactful for the story and the characters, they're not connected for you. You have to connect them yourself. And so that's why I took off half a point. It's an introductory episode. I from watching the series, I can attest that it does get more clear as you go on, and their stories get more developed. But just for an introductory episode, I could see that an individual having difficulty following these characters, if they watch this first episode, it's too hard to follow because not enough is explained, and then not watching the rest. So because of that, I would hate for somebody to not continue the series for that reason. And I do think that is a potential detriment. So that's why I gave 2.5 points out of 3.
Okay. So next category is aesthetics. So out of 2 points, I gave this 1 point. Don't come at me yet. Let me explain. I want to talk about all the good things first. The intro to the show, like the opening credits and things, absolutely gorgeous. You see the charcoal pencil making charcoal drawings. You see the charcoal like breaking off the pencil as it's used against the paper. Then you zoom out a little bit and it turns into one of the like scenes of the Marines. And so I just thought it was so interesting, like such an interesting way to like connect the art style to like the fluid motion of the video. Is very, very cool. Hans Zimmer on the music is absolutely wonderful. I mean, who doesn't love Hans Zimmer? So the music is fantastic. They have a lot of these beautiful shots. They take advantage of the sky really, really well, especially when they're on the island at Guadalcanal. They take advantage of the fact that they have this wide open sky, and they give us a lot of really cool shots with sunrise, sunset, kind of the pinky orange behind. Even at night when you have the shot where all of those ships are like being attacked and you don't know whose ship is whose or whatever. And they have the beautiful reflections off the water with the big open sky and all of that. It's just really, really lovely. Really, really lovely. However, I took off a point for a few things. From a storytelling perspective, the combat scenes make sense to be dark. However, they are so dark, it's very difficult to follow anything. And I understand that it's, you know, in a real life situation, there would be chaos and a level of confusion when having a firefight in the middle of the night. However, I think from a viewer's standpoint, it gets complicated and it can break concentration or focus during the scene because you can't tell what's happening anyway. So I think because there's so many moving parts and it's so dark and it's so difficult to see what's happening, that can be a little bit of a detriment. So that's one of those cases that I feel like it's acceptable in filmmaking to give us a little bit more than what would be natural light. Another thing is that there are lots of explosions and gunfire that happens in that scene, and they could have used those things and expanded their light flare for an extra second or a little bit wider. You could use those as good reasons to fake, giving you a little bit more light for just a split second to help establish where some of your characters are, what their current goal is or objective, how they're moving about, what they're currently using or holding, that sort of thing. I think you lose a lot of the detail of the choreography that has been planned for this scene because it's simply so dark. And while you want it to look realistic, there are ways to cheat that and give yourself more opportunities for more light. And they had opportunities with all of the, flares of explosion and things, and they could have used those opportunities to give you a little bit more light. And I think they didn't use it enough to their advantage. So that's one critique that I have. Also, you read the fact sheet and it said they had gotten an award for like sound mixing, but one of the things I noticed was how muted a lot of the combat sounds sounded in the sound mixing, which I thought was really weird. Or it felt like since you're in this wide open space, you expect a little reverb or echo, and there was like not that much of that. So I don't know, maybe that's just me being nitpicky, but I felt like some of the things that would be very loud and almost make you jump as a viewer were like muted or tampered down in a way.
But it is taking place on the beach. So there is sand.
Okay,
and
I guess that's fair.
Barricades.
Okay. I guess that's fair.
And there's water.
I guess I didn't consider those factors. Still, though, it felt like was that all the cacophony of sounds was the same level as some of the dialogue you're hearing, and it would have felt a little more realistic if you almost had to like not strain to hear your actors, but if the actors would have been naturally having to talk louder to be heard through all of the cacophony, and they're just talking at normal volume like this for a lot of that scene. So I don't know, just something about that like sort of pulled me out of the immersion just a smidge. I know scenes like that are so difficult to film, so I'm trying not to be too nitpicky, but it was just it's just the things that I noticed the most was the sounds and then the lights of those scenes. And then my last note, really, my last critique is when it's all said and done and it's the next morning and they start going through like the belongings of some of the Japanese soldiers that they have killed, and the men are all dirty, which makes perfect sense. You would be very dirty after a situation like that. However, if you notice, every single man has like the same dirt pattern smudged into their face. And you can tell that somebody just came and dirtied up their face. It doesn't look like natural dirt collection. It looks like someone came and did the same dirt pattern on everybody's cheeks and forehead and nose. So it's almost like I would have preferred it to look like fingerprints or something, like they had touched their face, with dirty hands or something, like runny almost. Even to see like sweat through some of that, but it's like you don't get any of that. It just looks like the same, like on everybody, like just the same dirt cake on everybody. So I felt like that was something that could have been easily fixed and just felt like a very rushed sort of special effects makeup job. So I think they could have done better in that regard. So those critiques are what made me give it 1 point out of 2.
So I actually gave this 1.5 points out of 2. I don't disagree with you, but I do think that the positives outweigh the negatives as far as aesthetics go. So the intro, I just think is absolutely beautiful. The first time I ever saw it, I stopped I have the DVDs. So I stopped it and restarted it just to watch that intro again. I just think it's absolutely beautiful. Combined with Hans Zimmer's score, it's just absolutely gorgeous. The score is fantastic. I think I really appreciate that the score doesn't overpower the combat scenes or the dialogue moments. It really feels like it's a companion to the film and not overpowering. I think we've talked about this many times, but when the music or the sound effects are so loud that you have to turn the volume down on your TV in the action scenes,
Annoying.
It's terrible. So I appreciated that I didn't have to do that in this episode. The sets, I think, and the locations are great. And not just on Guadalcanal, but even just the contrast of the way the Barcelone's home is set up and lit, and the furniture and the carpets on the floor. And then you contrast that location where it's supposed to be a very warm, a very family-oriented, welcoming environment, slightly bittersweet environment because they're saying goodbye. Contrast that to the snowy, frigid bus station where Lecky is saying goodbye to his dad. It's gorgeous. It's part of the storytelling, just the locations themselves. They could have very easily filmed Lecky saying goodbye to his dad on a bright sunny day or inside the bus station, but they chose to film it outside in the snow, in the cold, dark. Everything's very industrial looking, metals, just all of the locations add to the storytelling. And then you compare that to Eugene Sledge's introductory scene where this very antebellum style Southern affluent home and very warm tones, very bright natural light, and you can tell so much about who this character is just because of the way his house looks, the way his mom's dressed, things like that. So the storytelling is more than just the actions of the plot and the dialogue said, just very visually appealing and very strong visual storytelling. I also think the cinematography, one thing I noticed in this, I really appreciate that once they're on Guadalcanal and they're trekking through the jungle, or they're even in the battle, the combat scenes in the battle, the gunfire, they do a good job of balancing between close-up shots and wide shots. And I think that's often missed because we want to feel, tight and close up to the individuals in physical danger because now we feel that same sense of tension. But I appreciated that they did these wide shots of these soldiers moving as a unit, and then they would have close-up shots. I also like that they didn't overuse hand cameras. Shaky cam just really bothers me when it's overused, and I think that a lot of times it's way overused. I think the only time I really noticed in this episode where the camera seems kind of shaky is on the boats, when they're in the boats going out to the island. So I appreciate that they didn't, again, they balanced these wide shots and narrow and close-ups, and I didn't feel like I was getting seasick while they're on a boat. So those sorts of things that really just balanced it out, and I feel like that's not done very common in action films or war films. So I appreciated both of those things. Again, I also think that aesthetically, I do think there were some issues with the special effects, but I appreciated that the special effects weren't over the top. They're not shooting, a human being and you're watching blood spray 30 feet away and spraying everywhere. And it just, unnecessary gore is not present in this episode. And I really appreciate that. And from what I can remember, it's remains consistent throughout the rest of the show. And I believe that just gives a very respectful tone to the show, that this isn't just a gore fest or, a war film just for the sake of a war film. It's just trying to tell the story of these men. The reason I didn't give it full points is mostly for two reasons. I do think aesthetically, and I guess this could fall into plot as well, but either way, I do think the pacing gets a bit draggy once Lecky gets to Guadalcanal Island. There's just long stretches with no dialogue. You're watching them traverse through a field. You're watching them traverse around coconut trees. You're watching them traverse through the jungle. You're watching them, hang out in a trench or a foxhole somewhere. And it's very long. And I understand that it's setting up the rest of the story and it's building tension, but it does kind of feel like it drags. So maybe that should go in the plot versus the aesthetics, but I do think that, visually it's beautiful, but it does feel that it kind of drags a little bit. The other reason I took off half a point for aesthetics was because the CGI is very dated in this episode. It's most noticeable when they're climbing down the rope into the boats. I don't know the technical term for it, but they're climbing off the ship into the boat to traverse over to Guadalcanal. And there are shots where you're seeing the men in the foreground and a physical wall of the ship and a physical boat, and then everything behind them is CG. The ocean is CG, the ships back there are CG, the explosions are CG. And to me, it was pretty jarring to see that. And I get it, it's 2010, special effects have come a long way since then, but I think it was very noticeable. That moment in particular, and then also when they're sitting on the beach and you're seeing, I believe it's the Japanese ships all out in the harbor, that wall of ships out in the harbor, they all look CG. It's not anybody's fault. They made do with what they had, but to me, it's a little too noticeable. I would almost, I know it's expensive, but I would almost rather have just seen miniatures, and do some practical effects or in-camera effects, things like that. But the CGI is so noticeable in those shots. To me, it kind of pulled me out of that immersion. So 1.5 points out of 2 for me.
Okay. Next category is personal taste and preference. Out of 2 points, I gave this 1.5 points. I battled going back and forth between 1 point and 1.5 points. And the reason is because I genuinely do not gravitate toward action or war movies. That's not the sort of thing that I just go to the shelf and say, I'm in the mood for this. Rarely, if ever, do I choose an action or war movie. It's just not the genre that I resonate with a lot. However, I'm glad that Holland had suggested we watch this because my appreciation for history, even the uglier parts of it, have made it very interesting for me, even from the beginning. And knowing that the portrayal of these men are portrayals of real men is also really appealing to me. So I definitely want to see the rest. Even if we don't do it for the podcast, I'm pretty sure I'm going to finish this show simply because that first episode has just super impressed me and grabbed my attention. So I would say, is this my personal taste? No. but is it being presented in such a great way that I am 100% okay with continuing? Yes. So that's why I didn't want to give it full points, because it's not the sort of thing that I would typically like go to. This is not like, I feel like when I think of like movies I like, these sorts of things or series or whatever, this is not the sort of thing that like comes to mind. But I do think that what I've seen is very good, and I want to continue watching it. So that's why I gave it 1.5 points.
Cool. I also gave it 1.5 points out of 2. I do really enjoy this series. I think it's great. It's one that I really enjoy, but this first episode, since we're just reviewing this first episode, I do think it is a bit slow. It's good enough to make me want to continue, but it's not a top tier first episode of a TV show, and it's not even a top tier of this miniseries. I think it just gets better from here. So because we're just reviewing this one episode, I didn't give it full points. And because when you compare it to the rest of the series and the fact that this episode, like you said, you mentioned, the ending, and I do think that this miniseries is a good one to binge through if you can, digest it in one sitting, which it's a lot. I mean, it's a heavy subject matter, but definitely 2 episodes at a time. I think this is one of those episodes where it's like, if you watch this first episode and feel like it wasn't your cup of tea, keep pushing, at least watch the second episode and then decide. And that's how I feel about this episode in general. I think that it's not one of my favorites. I think it's a little slow. It takes some time for you to it's a great introduction of your characters, but it takes some time for you to really get to know them. So for that reason, I didn't give it full points, 1.5.
Okay. And our final category is creativity. Out of 1 point, I gave this 0.5 point. So aesthetically, this show does feel a lot fresher than some of the World War II based things that I've seen do. But it's not anything entirely groundbreaking or innovative in the genre. Do I think it is interesting? Because I think the reason that this show is interesting is because of the portrayals of the real men that were involved and how their personal writings influence a lot of the storytelling and dialogue. That's why I think that this is a very interesting show. However, as far as creative goes, I battled back and forth with this, which is why I decided to just go in the middle and go for 0.5 point, because there are quite a few like war movies and series out there. There's, quite a few things, even just based on World War II, but just war in general. It's kind of like its own genre. And while, sure, I haven't consumed a lot of that stuff, a lot of how the format of the show goes feels like what you would expect from a war movie. So do I think it's anything super groundbreaking? No. But do I think it's enjoyable and important and interesting? Yes. So that's why I decided to just kind of go in the middle and do 0.5 point.
Alrighty. I also gave it 0.5 point, but for different reasons. I think that in general, the World War II movie genre, if you can even quantify it as its own genre, it's very saturated. There's some very, very iconic World War II movies out there. However, I think this miniseries is very distinct in the fact that, one, it's a miniseries, for one, so it's much longer than your standard feature-length film, but also there is so few, and maybe this is just me being ignorant, but the majority of World War II stories are about the war in Germany and Europe. And there is so little told commonly about the war in the Pacific. And the presence that the U.S. military had in the Pacific was huge. The cost of lives lost over there was massive. And it's just kind of an untold front of the wars, a lot of untold stories. And so because this is telling the story of 3 men, and because it's a portion of World War II that nobody really talks about. Everybody talks about Nazi Germany, fighting Nazi Germany, and everybody talks about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But Hiroshima and Nagasaki is like the end of the discussion when it comes to the Pacific Front in World War II. So and of course, for our international listeners, I'm just speaking from a U.S. perspective. So, I know we have some listeners from overseas, many different countries. So maybe in your country of origin, you have different media available, but in the U.S., it's pretty much,
Nazi Germany.
Yeah. And then maybe we'll touch on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The only film I can think of off the top of my head, and of course this is just, I'm not a huge World War II buff, but the only movie I can think of off the top of my head that even covers the Pacific is Hacksaw Ridge, which is recent, more recent film. But I think movies, the big World War II movies, I think mostly cover Germany or Europe. So for that reason, and because I think I do think this series really has the potential to be iconic, especially with the way it's so respectful and how it's telling these stories. It's not sensationalizing war. It's not demonizing war. It's just showing you what war is and what this war was like. And I think that's very respectful. And so because of that, it has the potential to really become iconic. And granted, it was 2010, so it's been over a decade since this was released. But I think that because of that potential for an iconic piece of media and the fact that it's covering a subject matter that's not widespread or as widespread, that's why I give it half a point out of 1.
Okay.
So
Sounds
what was
good.
your total score?
My total score out of 10 is 7.5.
And that is my total score as well, 7.5.
Wow, it's been a while since we've had a matching score.
We haven't matched in a while.
Awesome.
Alrighty, you ready for some lightning round questions?
I think so.
Alrighty, so I don't have a ton, but I felt that it wouldn't be appropriate to ask more of the jovial questions that we asked.
Yeah, like the jokey ones.
So just some general just critiques or fun questions. So favorite character. I know you've just met them.
I know. I feel like I don't have enough information, so I'm just going to go with the information I have. But Bob Leckie is he seems like just a good man. So like, I think for now, until I continue to watch the series right now from episode 1, I think Bob Leckie is my favorite character.
Okay. I'm not going to answer this question because I don't want to spoil it for you.
Oh, okay.
So.
Okay. Interesting.
Because I don't want, I mean, I could tell you my answer. It's somebody that you've already met, but I don't want it to then influence what you think is going to happen to these characters.
Okay.
So I'm not going to answer the question.
Okay. That's fine.
So, do you have a least favorite character?
Yes, I do.
Oh,
it's
really?
Leckie's dad.
Yeah.
He's a jerk. Like the whole time, Leckie's just like wanting to have a little heartfelt moment with his dad. And his dad doesn't even acknowledge anything but his car and then handshakes him.
Which, I mean, I get it. Handshakes back then meant something.
I guess so.
But
it's like, there's no like heartfelt moment
so
leading up
cold.
to that. Yeah, he's
so
just
cold.
so cold toward his son.
Yeah. Leckie's dad's my least favorite character too. Also, Eugene Sledge's mom is not. She seems kind of.
She just seems like a very scared mom.
Does she?
Yeah.
I think she sounds like a not nice mom.
Oh, okay.
But yeah. Do you have a favorite story moment? So just specifically in storytelling, favorite moment.
So the moment after Eugene's dad walks away and is telling Eugene's mom that, the heart murmur's still there. And we flash back to Eugene and he's like getting dressed. He's putting his shirt back on and he just breaks down. And it only lasts like 10, 15 seconds. But like his whole face just crumples and my heart just like broke for him. And I just thought like that little moment just explained so much about him as a character. And like we don't really see him much in this episode, but just that tiny little moment just gave so much insight into like where he was and what his goals and motivations were and how something out of his control related to his body, has made him feel like now everything that he's hoping to get is just not, it cannot be in reach. So I just thought that was a nice little story moment there.
Yeah. I think for me, I really liked just that whole scene at John Bassilone's house. So like when the family member stands up and basically gives a toast, and then especially with just that very quiet moment between him and his dad. I just really like that. I also, I think that would probably be my favorite. That would be my favorite. Do you have a favorite moment, like with the special effects or an aesthetic moment? Not cinematography,
okay,
but just a visual moment.
I think there's probably two. One is the morning after the big combat scene, and they're standing on the beach, and the sky is just pink and orange, and it just stretches on forever. But it doesn't backlight so much that the guys that are standing there on the beach are like in silhouette. So it's like just like a nice light bounce there. So aesthetically, I just thought that was so pretty. And also at the very beginning of the episode, Lecky is like coming out of the church, and it's like cold, and the girl, Vera, I think is her name, is like walking in, and just the whole aesthetic of like the big wooden door of the church, and they're like in their nice 1940s, like, dapper garb, and her hair's all done and her makeup's all done, and just all those shots between them with like the big wooden door behind them were just really, really pretty, just right there in the beginning. So those were two good aesthetic moments, I think.
I think one of my favorite moments in this episode, and I will say, spoiler, it continues in other episodes, is the map, where they show the map of the Pacific.
Oh, yeah.
And they have, it's kind of overlaid with the rays of the Japanese Empire from the, the flag. And then they zoom in on the, the Guadalcanal, and it's overlaid with, kind of the Japanese influence. And so and this is just a, spoiler. It's not really that big of a spoiler, but I like how they use that map to show you what the enemy presence is like, and like where the battle's taking place. Because I think it's so easy to just think, on a Pacific island somewhere, and you have no idea where that is. Right. Or like how close that is to Japan, or how close that is to the US, and how widespread the influence and the military influence of the Japanese army was at the time. So I think it just sets a lot of things in perspective. And I just think it's really good storytelling.
Awesome.
Do you have a favorite visual moment for cinematography?
There was one shot that I really liked. I like these sorts of shots in general, but it's near the beginning when the captain, whoever he was,
Chesty
mm-hmm. is like kind of giving like, this is what we're going to do. Like, this is our mission as the Marines. Like, our job is going to be to focus on the Pacific, blah, 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 blah. And they must have either shot this, they had to have shot this with a crane or something, but it's like back over the shoulders of all of the Marines standing in the room, and it just pushes in so nicely. And I don't think that was zoom. I think it was physical movement of the camera, and it just feels so nice and fluid. And in a way, it's like it doesn't detract the focus from Chesty as he's talking, but it's almost like you get an idea, or like almost like a feeling of being in the room, because you still see all of the Marines. So it helps you kind of like buy the story that like this is a very packed room, and he's talking to a lot of people, and everybody's sort of in it all together. So it's like a feeling of camaraderie, without being like silly or anything like that. It's not like a jovial kind of camaraderie, but almost just like okay, like we have each other's backs in this. We're going to do what it takes to like meet our goal. And it's weird how like sometimes just like the technical things that you do in a camera can give you that sort of impression of things, but it's almost like it felt emotional in a way, just the movement of that camera.
I think one of my favorite moments in this episode in particular is when they're in the really intense firefight against the Japanese soldiers, and there's a shot. The camera looks right down the barrel of the machine gun that Lecky is firing, and it kind of zooms in on that machine gun as it's firing, and then it drastically cuts to the dead soldiers on the beach. And I think it's just a very, very good moment where you're not watching necessarily the carnage of all these men dying, but you're not spared the impact of the aftermath. And so again, I think I know I just sound like a broken record at this point. Again, I think it's just respectful storytelling where it's not downplaying the horrors of war, but it's not sensationalizing it and making it this spectacle. So I think, and you don't have to sit there as a viewer and wait for the battle to end on screen before you know the outcome. So I just thought it was a great moment of storytelling, and it's very heavy. It's very, very difficult to watch. But I think that it's just done very tastefully. Any final thoughts?
No, I don't think so. I think that's everything.
Alrighty. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us on this episode. We hope you had a good time. We did. But if you don't, feel free to tell us why. You can get links to our show notes, our Patreon, socials, and a suggestion box. They're all on our website at lineandmousepodcast.com. You can also review this episode on whichever podcast platform you prefer and let us know what you think. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we will catch you in the next one.